Bom dia a todos. Nós estamos aqui no Departamento de Psiquiatria, aí de Vila Mariana, com a transmissão de mais uma reunião clínica. Agradeço a audiência de todos os colegas presentes e os que estão nos seguindo no YouTube. Nós temos hoje aqui no departamento 2 visitantes. Nós temos um professor de Portugal, que é o Henrique Prata Ribeiro, que ele é da Católica, que trabalha em Lisboa, e ele é também assessor parlamentar no Parlamento de Portugal sobre as questões de saúde mental. Então, ao longo do tempo, nós temos tido contato, e ele quer receber gente do Brasil, e nós vamos receber também colegas de Portugal. Lembrar aqui que essa transmissão tem o patrocínio, um patrocínio que nos ajuda a transmitir essa reunião clínica para todo o Brasil, e depois ela fica depositada no nosso canal YouTube. Nós temos uma convidada estrangeira hoje, muito legal, que é a doutora Sara Van Bronkhorst. Right? Ela trabalha com a Andrea Jakovski, trabalha também com uma colega nossa, que está na Colômbia, que é a doutora Cristiane Duarte, né? E trabalha com o pessoal ali da Colômbia. Ela fez residência em Child and Adolescent Psychiatry na Columbia University College of Physicians. Ela fez residência em psiquiatria na Michigan State University and Pine Rest Christian Mental Health Services. Ela fez PhD no Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Sarah, welcome to our department. She's going to present to us the role of oxytocin and early social interactions in the intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experience. And Dr. Andrea Jakovski is following us from Norway. So, Andrea, nice to have you among us. So, thank you for bringing Sarah to our department. Sarah, please, go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Sarah Van Bronkhorst. I've been working with Dr. Jakovski. You say it different than how I say it. Apologies, Andrea. But I've been working with the Healthy Minds team for about 4 years now, and I'm so excited to be here in Sao Paulo and to meet the team and see all of the good work that you're doing here. Don't. Okay. And I have no disclosures. So today I'm going to be talking about the role of oxytocin and social interactions in the transmission of trauma. And just giving you an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. First, talking about the intergenerational transmission of adversity, looking specifically at childhood adversity. Next, talking about oxytocin and social behaviors, including the function and the development of the oxytocin system. Next, talking about the role of oxytocin specifically in the transmission of adversity from parent to offspring. Next, talking about the Healthy Minds study here in Sao Paulo and some of the preliminary data that we have on newborn oxytocin levels. And then finally, talking a bit about some clinical applications. So there are multiple different types of childhood adversity and different ways that we can measure it. And you can look at the different types of adversity, the severity, the accumulation of trauma. We hear talk about maltreatment, looking specifically at abuse and neglect. You can look at adversity more broadly. And in our study, we chose to use an instrument called the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this is a questionnaire that was developed in the 1990s in California. And it's a very simple questionnaire, which I think is why it's very popular. It's just a number of yes and no questions looking at different types of childhood adversity. And we look at trauma. And so we can look at abuse as in physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, looking at neglect, so physical neglect, emotional neglect, and then also looking more broadly at different types of family dysfunction. So does someone in your family have mental illness? Has someone been incarcerated? And you hear me okay? Okay. And this questionnaire doesn't look at, duration or severity, but what's powerful about it is that it has been shown in multiple different studies to predict later adult outcomes. And what we find with this questionnaire is that there is a dose-response relationship with the accumulation of these types of adversity and later outcomes. And many studies have looked at this, and what we find is that across a broad spectrum of different outcomes, there is this predictive value in the questionnaire. And so looking at psychiatric problems, the higher the ACEs, the more likely you have things like depression, anxiety, substance use problems. Looking at physical health, so things like autoimmune diseases, heart disease, cancer, COPD, the higher the ACEs, the more likely you have these physical health problems. And then also looking more broadly at social well-being. And so this is things like work performance, financial problems, likelihood to have anger outbursts. The higher the ACEs, the more likely that later in life you will have these problems. And so we see that in the individual, there are these later problems. And the next question is, can some of the effects of childhood adversity be transmitted to the next generation as well? So this has been studied both in animal models as well as in human studies. And looking at animal models, this is primarily rodents, and for various reasons, they have mostly been looking at male rodents. And what they do to simulate the experience of childhood adversity, because you can't look at the effects of divorce or incarceration on rodents. So what they do usually is they separate the baby rodents from their parents, and then they compare these babies to other ones who were raised by their mothers. And what they find is that these rodents who were raised without their mothers have changes in their stress response. We see differences in neuronal function and emotional behavior. And then looking at human studies, and it's kind of interesting because whereas in rodents, they're looking primarily at males, in human studies so far, primarily we have looked at childhood adversity in mothers and how the effects are transmitted. But what they find is similarly there are challenges in the offspring of these mothers. And so in the smaller children, we see externalizing and internalizing problems. And then as the children get older, we see higher rates of depression and anxiety. And then also some of the socio-emotional development problems. And so a broad range of difficulties in the offspring of these mothers. And these, whereas the studies of ACEs and the long-term impacts on the individual have been going on for years, this is a bit newer, and so the studies aren't quite as rigorous, but we are seeing similar problems. So the next question is, if we're seeing these challenges, if we're seeing these problems in the offspring, how does this happen? What are the mechanisms of transmission? And the reason we want to do this is because if we can figure out what the mechanisms are, then we have points of intervention so that we can help prevent some of these later problems. There is this, this term, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, ghosts in the nursery. And this is something that Selma Freyberg in 1975 came up with. And then later, a complementary idea, angels in the nursery, was developed by Alicia Lieberman in 2005. And what the idea here is that your parents' behaviors toward you, even before you're old enough to develop explicit memories, are in some ways imprinted in you. So even as an infant, you are learning how your parent is interacting with you. And then what we see is that later, when you have your own children, some of these same behaviors you start to naturally parent. So unless you explicitly try to parent differently, you are likely to interact with your baby the same way that your parent interacted with you. And so ghosts in the nursery is like the negative parenting. And then we also see the flip side, the angels in the nursery, the positive parenting. So we look at different parenting patterns, this idea of parenting begets parenting. And the idea here is that children who experience childhood adversity are experiencing some of these negative parenting patterns, and that those might be transmitted to the next generation. And what we can do is look very closely at the different types of interactions that a parent is having with their child. So we can do a video of parent-child interaction and code different aspects of those interactions. And on the negative side, we can look at patterns and behaviors that are hostile, anxious, intrusive parenting. So the parent goes in and says, no, don't do it that way. We're going to do it this way, or overriding, saying, okay, this is your idea. I'm not going to give you autonomy. I'm going to say, do it differently. And then on the other side, you can have parents who are depressed. And so you might see more withdrawn behavior, not engaging and interacting with your baby. And then looking at the angels in the nursery side, so some of these positive parenting behaviors. So we talk about sensitive parenting, warmth, playfulness, attunement. And so that's like noticing what your child is doing and responsivity. So I'm going to respond in a way that shows that I care about you, that you're loved. And I have a 8-month-old baby who I brought with me to Brazil. And I have to say that everyone here has been incredibly warm and loving and engaged, and you have a wonderful culture here, just wonderful. You feel very loved. So indeed, when we look at maternal ACEs, maternal childhood adversity, we see that the parenting behaviors are of lower quality. So there isn't as much sensitivity and warmth and attunement in mothers who have experienced high ACEs. We recently published a paper in Psychiatry where we were looking at resilience to the effects of ACEs. And this is in one generation. And so in the kids who experienced high ACEs, looking later for adult outcomes. And this is a big cohort study that Dr. Duarte has in Puerto Rico and in New York. And what we did is we looked at the quality of parent-child relationship, asking both the kids and the adults and asking at several time points during childhood. And then later in adulthood, so around 20 years old, we assessed for major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, substance use problems, stress. And what we found, not super surprisingly, but what people have kind of gotten excited about is that the better the relationship between the child and the adult, the less likelihood of later anxiety, depression, and stress. So those are some of the proposed behavioral mechanisms of the transmission of trauma. And, we also are curious about what are the underlying biological mechanisms of this transmission. And a lot of the research so far has focused on the stress response, so cortisol. And what we find is that early life trauma can lead to a later toxic stress response in the individual. And so we can see long-term changes in brain structure and functioning. And then in addition to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is like your stress response, your cortisol, people have started to also look at the oxytocin system. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what oxytocin is and its functioning. But what we see is that there are changes. And so both in the stress response and in the oxytocin system. And these changes have also been seen in animal models, and what they find is that similar to what we talked about earlier, there is reduced activation in the subcortical brain regions associated with parenting, so the caretaking behaviors, as well as an altered dopamine response in the nucleus accumbens, and that is a lot of your reward center in learning. So, I think it's helpful to think about this additionally from an evolutionary perspective. And so the way that organisms work is we have some things that our system can change biologically to adapt to this specific environment that we're raised in. And so this is incredibly adaptive from an evolutionary perspective, because as an organism is growing, we can develop in a way that's going to help protect us as adults. So if a child is raised in an environment that is very dangerous, there's a lot of stress, and the relationships that we have might be life-threatening, then what we can do is develop a system where we can respond very quickly. You might be very hyper alert. Your body can fight very quickly. And so that's adaptive to a specific environment that you are being raised in. However, if you develop this stress response that's ready for danger, what we think is that that might come at the expense of other functioning. And so it might be at the expense of longevity or peace and joy. And so you're attuned to a dangerous environment, but you might not have some of the other positive longevity type of development. So now I want to shift and talk specifically about oxytocin, which is something that I'm interested in. So what is oxytocin? Oxytocin is a hormone of affiliation. It's a hormone of love, of relationships, of social behaviors. And oxytocin is a very ancient hormone evolutionarily, and so we see it in very primitive organisms. And it's really played a key role in our species' survival. And it's very much connected with the stress response system. And so when we are facing stress, then oxytocin helps to gauge different social behaviors to reduce that stress. And so effectively what it does is when a species is faced with an external stressor, people can bond together and fight the stressor together. And so it promotes social behaviors that really helps species survival. And it's a hormone across the lifespan. So looking at birth, it stimulates labor and breastfeeding. And then after childbirth, it really helps promote the parent-child bonding. So we're looking at attachment and bonding, and oxytocin underlies a lot of these behaviors. And then as you grow, oxytocin helps promote friendships and sexual relationships. It underlies orgasm functioning, and then also looking at in-group behavior. So this is things like social, religious, community groups. And, you know, you look at any culture and there are always, you know, in-group versus out-group, us versus them. And oxytocin underlies a lot of the behaviors and emotions that help you connect with your different groups. So it's your partner, it's your family, it's your friends, it's the larger social groups. And interestingly, it also helps to exclude those who are not in your in-group. And so there's a really interesting study looking at soldiers in war, and what oxytocin helped to promote was more of the aggressive behaviors toward those who are not in your in-group. So it's not always just a love and peace hormone. It can also help with aggression when you are fighting your out-group. So I'm going to go over this a little bit quickly for the sake of time, but this is a figure that shows the different pathways of oxytocin in the brain, and what I'm looking at here is that oxytocin has functions across multiple different aspects of our experiences. And so in the pink here, we're looking at social learning and the nucleus accumbens. Oxytocin modulates behaviors based on inputs such as stress and drugs. And then looking at, in the orange here is the limbic circuits, the amygdala, the brainstem. Oxytocin regulates emotions, and like I was talking about earlier, it reduces the stress response. So the amygdala is like your fear and memory, that very primitive reaction to threat. And there's connections from there to the brainstem. And the brainstem is what will help your body prepare for that threat. So like the fight or flight, the freezing behaviors. And so, you know, you get a threat, goes to the amygdala says, okay, freak out, you know, like do something. And what oxytocin does is it dampens that connection. And so let's say that you're faced with a threat, you look to your friend is like, it's gonna be okay, we're gonna do this together, and your body calms down. You don't have that fight or flight response like you would, or a little less. And then pain regulation, so that's in the purple. And what oxytocin can do is modulate your experience of pain. So thinking about if you're in labor and you have someone, you know, giving you a massage or even warmth, and what oxytocin will do is it will reduce the sensation of pain a little bit. So this is something that I learned about recently, is the development of oxytocin, the oxytocin system, and looking during embryogenesis, the neurons develop about mid-pregnancy, but this is a very immature form of oxytocin, and the oxytocin is localized to the hypothalamus. And we don't really see the full oxytocin system until postnatally. So what this means is that the baby doesn't develop a functioning oxytocin system until they've been alive for a little while. And if you look back to this figure, you see in the green is the hypothalamus, and that's where at birth, the oxytocin neurons are, but all of these projections to the different parts of the brain don't develop until postnatally. So we don't see the axons stretching to the different parts of the brain until after birth. And I think this is important because looking at interventions to help promote a positive oxytocin system, both, prenatally as the baby's developing, but also postnatally. I think there are points of intervention. This is a really beautiful paper that was published a few years ago. It's a 4-part meta-analysis where they look at how early life stress impacts later oxytocin functioning. So it's not looking at that intergenerational link, but it is looking within one person. And what they found is that adults who have experienced early life stress typically, or on average, have lower oxytocin levels. And also looking at children, they see a similar thing. So if a child has experienced a lot of early life stress, they'll have lower oxytocin levels typically. And then higher oxytocin receptor methylation. And if you think about methylation, it's kind of like dampening. So the oxytocin receptors tend to be a little more dampened for those who have experienced early life stress. And then this is something I find very interesting, is that there's a little bit of a different response to oxytocin that is administered exogenously. So what this is that adults who have oxytocin, usually it's through the nose, like they're given a little dose of oxytocin and then put in a stressful situation, tend to respond differently to that oxytocin. So whereas in people who have not had a lot of childhood stress, the oxytocin promotes the positive behaviors, reduces stress. Those who have had this early life stress sometimes have an opposite response and they actually get more stressed. And I think conceptually this makes sense, because if you grow up in an environment where your relationships are dangerous, so you are abused by your parent, then when you are exposed to oxytocin, that might increase your stress because it's like this relationship is dangerous. But this is showing that your biology can be affected. So what are some potential mechanisms for the role of oxytocin in the intergeneration? Hello? 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 Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Perfect, thank you. All right, so what are some mechanisms for the role of oxytocin? Okay, good. So first, looking at caregiving behaviors, and there are a lot of studies that show that caregiving behaviors are related to oxytocin. And so in general, higher oxytocin improves the quality of these caregiving behaviors. So if a person experiences childhood trauma, then their caregiving behaviors may be of a lower quality, and that affects the offspring. So that could be one of the mechanisms. And then also it could be that not only is the child affected by the behaviors of the parent, but there could be a direct impact on the child's oxytocin system. So this may occur during gestation, prenatally. If the parent has experienced childhood adversity, it could directly affect their oxytocin system. So even if they have really positive caregiving behaviors, the child still may have an altered oxytocin system. So these are some of the studies, these are some of the questions that we are looking at in the Healthy Mind study. So the Healthy Maternal Infant Neurodevelopment Study is a study that is a collaboration between UNIFESP here and Duke University, and then in New York, Columbia University, and New York State Psychiatric Institute. And this is a cohort study The participants are here in Sao Paulo, approximately 500 mother-child dyads. And mothers are enrolled during pregnancy. These are healthy participants who have low-risk pregnancies. And participants are recruited from the public healthcare system here. And once the babies are born, they're enrolled at birth, and the kids and their parents are followed for at least 2 years of age and maybe longer. And we, one of the things that we are looking at is the oxytocin system and mother-child interactions. And this grant, which is part of the larger study, is looking specifically at the hypothesis that mothers with high ACEs would be more likely to have children with lower oxytocin levels, and that this would correlate with later toddler behavioral changes. And so left to right here, during pregnancy, the 3rd trimester, we assess for maternal adverse childhood experiences. And then at several time points during infancy, we look at oxytocin levels, both in the baby as well as the mom. And we also look at mother-child interactions. And so we ask the mother to interact with their baby as they normally would. We videotape for about 15 minutes, and then we systematically code the different caretaking behaviors that are seen. So this is some of the things that we talked about earlier, like sensitivity, responsivity, hostility, etc. And, sorry. Okay, great. Okay. And we have some really preliminary results looking at newborn infants. And so this is a very small sample. We have a much larger one that we're almost ready to present. But what we have here are newborns, about 20 of them, and about half female, half male. The average infant age was about 28 days. And the cumulative maternal ACEs there is 3.5, which is quite high, but also kind of what we expected, because the mothers here are recruited from areas where there is a lot of violence and poverty. So the last 2 lines here, the infant oxytocin and the maternal oxytocin, what we found was that these newborns had very high levels of oxytocin. So if you look at different studies, the average that we saw in mothers here is pretty typical of what other studies have reported, but the newborn levels were very high. And this is the first study, one of the first studies to our knowledge, that is actually looking at infants this young and seeing what oxytocin levels are. So our primary hypothesis was that high, sorry, that's okay. Thank you. So our primary hypothesis was that high maternal ACEs would be associated with lower child oxytocin levels. And, you know, this is a very small study, and what we found was there is no association between maternal ACEs, which is on the x-axis, and then infant oxytocin level, which is on the y-axis. And we also looked at maternal oxytocin levels, and that is the figure on the right. And again, there's no correlation between maternal oxytocin levels and maternal ACEs. But if you look at these 2 figures, what you see is that The maternal ACEs, again on the right side, are much lower than the newborn oxytocin levels, which on average are much higher. And so, like I said, this is the first study kind of looking at this, and we started to wonder, like why are the levels so high? What are we detecting here? And we looked at multiple different variables that might explain this, thinking about what oxytocin is involved in. Was it, mothers who had C-section versus vaginal delivery? And the half-life of oxytocin is like 3 to 5 minutes. And so, there really isn't a plausible connection between these two. And analyzing it, we didn't see anything. We thought about breastfeeding, didn't see anything. And also there really isn't much transmission of oxytocin through breast milk. Infant sex, there wasn't anything. But what we found, so this is just one more figure showing that the newborns were much higher than a similar study that we looked at with toddlers. What we found was that there was a very strong correlation between infant oxytocin level and age. And so on the left here, we have infants about 20 days of age going up to 40 days of age. And there's this a sharp decline in the oxytocin levels across these several weeks. And so what we think this means is that during this very early period of development, oxytocin levels go from quite high to quite low. And so this could be a sensitive period in the development of the oxytocin system and a very important time point for a child's development of oxytocin. So some clinical implications, when you're looking at a study that's so small, you don't want to make any, like big clinical changes, but thinking about things that we already know are good, I think it reinforces some of these things. So like skin-to-skin contact, which has become a really big thing in the neonatal medical community, is very important. Early parent-child bonding, so helping facilitate parents having time to be with their babies at birth, and so maybe a longer parental leave from work, helping reduce stress around this time period so that parents can bond with their children. Potential role of very early interventions to positively influence the development of the oxytocin, specifically for higher risk infants. So maybe parents who are under a lot of stress, have undergone a lot of childhood adversity or other challenges, maybe making sure that these infants in particular are able to have a positive social environment early on. So just a summary of the different things that we talked about today. First, childhood adversity is associated with lasting effects. And this is something that there is strong evidence for. Caretaking behaviors and oxytocin may play a role in the transmission of trauma. And this is a number of different studies looking at these different aspects. And then in our small study, we found very high levels of oxytocin in infants during the newborn period. And I have a lot of thanks and acknowledgements. Dr. Andrea Jakowski, Dr. Duarte, who is my personal mentor, Dr. Posner, Marcos, Alini Danilo, and then in Israel, A.L. Abraham, as well as the wonderful staff and team here in Brazil. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I do a lot of clinical work, and I tried at multiple points to quit research just because, it's hard. But I really have to say the wonderful people in the team that we have kept me in it, because it's a wonderful community. So thank you. And I am open to any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, you can go.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's getting more convincing, the sort of intergenerational transmission. It sounded something like, it would be weird to think about that without having exactly what could be the main biological mechanisms and the behavioral mechanisms involved in the oxytocin, because the HPA axis was already very common. The studies by Michael Meany and people from McGill, they showed with, the rats and everything. But anyway, showing that in humans is incredible. Tell me something, this paper in JAMA Psychiatry, was it a follow-up? Was it a follow-up or yes? How long was that?
Yeah, so this...
I will check it.
Yeah, so this study, it's the Boricua Youth Study, and the participants were followed from the time that they were about 8 to 10 or so up until between 20 and 30, and they were followed. And what the team has done is also enroll the children of these participants, and so we'll be able to look at the next generation as well. So right now it's mostly just the children who have grown up, but now Dr. Duarte's team has also enrolled the children, so following them as well.
Yeah. Do you have any transcultural studies done comparing levels of oxytocin and the level of adversities as well? I mean, could be, populational distributed.
I don't know of studies that compare oxytocin levels in different cultures. I think that's very interesting, and there could be hypotheses around different cultural behaviors and how that might correlate. The papers that I've looked at tend to have similar levels of oxytocin, and Dr. Ruth Feldman, who has done a lot of the work with oxytocin, has studied in different cultures and has had similar results, but I don't know of comparisons between cultures.
Yeah, what makes me, think that is very important also to have a high level of ACEs in the population, because then the prevalences would be easier to study. In a place where you don't have ACEs, it would be more difficult to find. But I think, Brazil, the United States, I mean, there are some places where that could be much easier to prove, let's say, to show the relationship.
Yeah, I think that is one of the strengths of the Healthy Mind study, is that the participants do have a lot of exposure to adversity and different types of violence. And looking at traditionally at the ACEs study that was started in the 1990s, the participants were mostly white, college educated, more affluent, and there's been a lot of criticism, why are these the people that we're studying, when it's the people who experience more adversity that are the ones that are more impacted by it. And so I think it is, that is one of the strengths of the study.
Sarah, next question.
Yeah.
Do you think we can change it? Is there any way to screen for it and to intervene, trying to really change the, particularly the parental-child bonds, Could we think about any sort of intervention that could improve and changing that? I mean, it would be fascinating.
Yeah, I think this is a big reason why a lot of us get into research, is we want to make those We want to be able to make those changes. We want to be able to develop interventions to prevent some of this transmission. And I think it's important to first and foremost acknowledge that the best way to do that is to reduce the actual exposure to the adversities. And then we can also look at interventions to reduce, like secondary interventions to reduce the impact of the adversities. But yes, there are wonderful programs that can teach positive parent-child interactions. And I think even educating mothers about and fathers about how maybe some of their own experiences might influence how they interact with their baby, and that if they change, they can be empowered to make a lasting difference on their child. And, you know, providing some of that education can be important, but also not putting all the onus of responsibility on the mother, I think, is important in talking about systemic changes. You know, how can we reduce the stress that the mom has so that she can bond with her baby? How can we reduce the, you know, the challenges in the environment that impede the relationship? So there are so many things we can do.
Good.
Just have to talk to the people with money.
For questions. Enrique.
Hi, and thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. I'd like to know two things. One is, how do you define the ACEs? So is it perceived ACEs? Because it's important that sometimes people go through events that would be considered ACEs, but if they're very regular in the area where they live, they don't have the same impact as they would. So that would be a question for me, like, how do you select what is considered an ACE? And then going as well through Professor Jair's questions, do you think, so the way to give information to people seems to be very important. So people need to know that they impact their children's life for good in childhood. So which are the best channels that you think we should give information through? Because in a public health matter, that would be very relevant. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Can I use that one?
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, I don't.
Não está funcionando isso? Go ahead. Do you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah. Is this? I don't know if it's right.
Oi.
Okay. I can. Okay. Well, sorry. So, you know, the first question, what do we consider an ACE? And so, whereas one person who goes through a specific experience might say that was emotional abuse, and another person might say, no, that's just normal. That's not abuse. And yes, it's very much dependent on what the person's perception is of their experience. But what we find is that it predicts it nonetheless. And so what you perceive your childhood experiences to have been predicts what your outcomes are. And then also we look at different, more objective evaluations of childhood experiences. So you can look at kids who are involved in the like child protective systems, so where there's been reports of abuse, and we see similar outcomes. And so, you know, there are benefits and downsides to every type of assessment, but we find that, you know, whichever way you measure it, it does predict outcomes. And then the second one, I think, is a wonderful question. You know, what's the best way to communicate and teach people about these problems, and also their potential to make a positive impact on their children in a public health system. And I think that universal screening and universal offering of services is really important. And so maybe it is in the pediatrics clinics where, you know, the moms and babies are coming in for their regular assessments, and having someone there to provide some education, I think, could be helpful going out into the community.
Now, Andrea, do you want to show yourself? Hi.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Sarah. Nice presentation. We are very happy to hear that you're still enthusiastic about doing research with us. And
Yes.
because I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but collecting saliva from newborns is really challenging. There are not many studies in the literature from where Sarah could use as a base for her studies. There are studies in prematures and oxytocin, but there are not studies on babies that were born at full term. So it's quite a challenge that she took, and she has an amazing sample with over 300 diets. But one thing that I was thinking while Jair was mentioning the advantages of studying oxytocin in countries with higher rates of ACEs and how we can compare that from one culture to another culture, I think one item that we need to take into consideration is resilience. Because although our sample presents higher levels of ACEs, an average of 3, and 60% of the sample over 3 ACEs in life, the resilience level is really high in our population. And when you compare to a population like, I'm going to take as an example the Norwegian population, which has like 0 to 1 ACEs, but the resilience level is really low. So that means that impact is actually, it might be higher in this population than it is in Brazil. So that's something that we should take in consideration when doing cross-cultural comparisons. It was just a comment. And congratulations for your lecture, Sarah. It was really good.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you know, I really have to give kudos to the team here in Brazil and Helene for making this possible, because I was told that you can't collect saliva in newborns, and did it anyway. The team here is wonderful. And I also have been told that the amount of saliva can vary across cultures, which is interesting. We don't know about oxytocin, but that might be a factor. And yes, resilience. So resilience is one of the things that I am very much interested in. And I think it's important to not just talk about risk and talking about people being doomed. Like does oxytocin promote resilience? We know that it helps species survival. We know that it helps people bond to fight off threat. Can it provide resilience to some of this adversity? And the sample here has shown that there is, like Andrea was saying, there is a lot of resilience. So despite these very high level of ACEs, the anxiety, depression, stress is lower than expected. And so the next question is, okay, why? Like what's going so well that despite this adversity, people are doing well?
People, they are working in the project in Brazil. Would you like to tell people what you are doing? Tell in Portuguese, they can understand. Célia? But I'm going to ask them to tell in Portuguese.
Wonderful.
Just for all the residents and other people, lots of audience, in the YouTube, so it was very nice. It's been very nice. So, Célia, conta para o pessoal o que vocês estão fazendo e dá um resuminho, para se alguém não entendeu exatamente a dimensão desse trabalho, né? E enfim, a importância desse trabalho internacional, né?
Tá. Então, é um trabalho que começou lá até antes da pandemia, né? Aí, logo no início de 2021, antes mesmo da gente já ter tomado as doses da vacina, a gente começou a coleta de todo o estudo, né? A coleta que eu digo que envolve a coleta de saliva, para a gente ter os dados de ocitocina e cortisol, bem como da ressonância magnética. Então, vocês imaginam o trabalho que é colocar um bebê numa máquina de ressonância magnética, um bebê de 2 semanas a 6 semanas, e todo o trabalho que veio antes disso, né? Nas UBSs, que nós temos 5 UBSs cadastradas em Guarulhos, mais o amparo maternal. Então, essas mães eram contactadas por um grupo de psicólogos, temos alguns aqui hoje, e aí elas estavam de 25 semanas, de 25 a 39 semanas, e eram contactadas e convidadas a participarem do estudo. E aí uma série de questionários eram aplicados, que incluíam o termo de consentimento e mais os fatores de inclusão e exclusão, né? Dependendo se era uma gravidez de risco, essa mãe não participaria do estudo. Então, a partir disso, no parto, já era coletado a placenta, então tinha todo o envolvimento das equipes do hospital. Essa mãe era acompanhada durante todo esse processo. Para isso, para a gente não perder essa mãe, era colocado um adesivinho na carteirinha da mãe de maternidade. E, assim, quando ela chegasse no dia do parto, o hospital já estava sabendo que ela fazia parte de uma pesquisa e o material biológico era coletado ali. E depois de semanas, essa mãe comparecia aqui na Unifesp para o exame de ressonância magnética do bebê, onde eram coletados todos esse material que a gente comentou agora. E o preparo do bebê, e o mais importante disso tudo, que tinha uma consulta com uma pediatra. Então, os fatores que convenciam essa mãe a comparecer aqui, porque a gente sabe que no SUS nós temos um excelente, né, sistema de saúde pública, mas a gente sabe que a demanda é muito alta, e essa mãe nem sempre tem acesso a um pediatra numa UBS. Então, só o apelo de ter um exame completo com uma pediatra no dia de um exame de ressonância magnética já era um alto fator para convencer a mãe a trazer o bebê. E a ressonância magnética é um exame muito seguro, porque ela não tem nenhum tipo de radiação. Então, a gente pode colocar um bebê, um recém-nascido, na máquina sem nenhum problema, mas a gente tem que proteger muito o ouvido por causa do barulho. Então, nós colocávamos, depois do exame da pediatra, colocado a proteção no ouvido dos bebês. Enquanto isso, toda a equipe que estava no dia trabalhando já ia coletando a saliva e o cabelo do bebê para os exames de cortisol. E colocávamos 3 camadas de proteção no ouvido do bebê. A mãe se dirigia até a sala de ressonância, onde ela começava a amamentar o bebê, a gente colocava o oxímetro e o exame era feito. Então, basicamente, era esse o processo.
Vocês estão observando a relação mãe-criança?
Sim, isso é importante, talvez o Marcos possa explicar isso muito melhor. No dia era feita uma gravação de 5 minutos, com a mãe logo após a ressonância, onde o bebê tinha que estar acordado, não chorando. Aí, se o Marcos puder explicar rapidamente como era feito, acho que é melhor.
Por favor.
O importante também é que o exame de ressonância magnética era laudado por um médico, por um médico radiologista, e depois era entregue esse laudo para a mãe. E se tivesse alguma alteração, ele é encaminhado para uma neurologista.
Obrigado, Célia. Eu sou o Marcos Fanton, faço parte do grupo, né? Nessa pesquisa, estou fazendo meu doutorado, e originalmente o projeto ele não incluía, né, essas questões mais observacionais do comportamento da mãe na interação com o bebê, e aí, com a entrada no projeto, a gente incluiu esses fatores, e se mostrou algo bastante importante, como a Sara mesma mostrou, né, correlacionado com o desenvolvimento futuro da prole, etc., e toda a correlação que a gente viu com a ocitocina. Então, como a Célia estava falando, no dia da ressonância magnética, a gente pedia que a mãe, a gente colocava, né, a mãe e o bebê numa sala reservada e pedia que ela interagisse com o bebê por 5 minutos, como ela normalmente fazia quando estava em casa. E a gente filma essa interação, né, 5 minutos, e depois há todo um trabalho de codificação dessa interação, desses 5 minutos eu codifiquei pessoalmente, né, com a ajuda também de alguns outros research assistants, codificamos 3 minutos dessa interação do dia da ressonância magnética, né? Então, é um processo bastante trabalhoso de codificação desses vídeos, mas esse processo de filmagem da interação mãe-bebê, ele se repetiu em todos os time points da pesquisa, né? Porque a gente acompanha esse bebê até ele completar 2 anos de idade. Então, temos aí mais time points aos 6 meses, aos 14, 18 e 24. Então, todos os time points a gente fez essa filmagem também, variando somente um pouco a instrução que é dada à mãe, porque após uma certa idade, especificamente a partir dos 14 meses, do time point de 14 meses, a gente instrui que a mãe brinque com o bebê, como ela normalmente faz, ao invés de somente interagir, ou seja, a partir dos 14 meses, a gente oferecia brinquedos também, para a mãe usar com o bebê, mas no time point dos 6 meses do primeiro mês, era só a mãe com o bebê. Né? E também, nesses time points mais avançados, o tempo de filmagem era um pouquinho maior, porque a gente entende que há mais variação de comportamento da criança, né? Tem um range maior de comportamentos, então a gente precisa de um tempinho um pouco maior para observar tudo isso. E aí, a codificação desses vídeos do primeiro time point já estão completas, depois de muito trabalho, e ainda estamos trabalhando na codificação dos vídeos dos time points seguintes.
Dá para perceber na observação as diferenças de maternagem?
Sim, em alguns casos fica bastante evidente, principalmente naqueles casos em que a mãe tem uma atitude mais hostil, ou mesmo o comportamento de withdrawal, como a Sara comentou, né, quando a mãe está mais depressiva, né, mães mais ansiosas, fica bastante evidente no comportamento, mas tem coisas mais refinadas que um olhar assim mais geral não capturaria. Né? Então, por isso que no primeiro mês a gente adotou um sistema de codificação mais refinado, que a gente chama de microcodificação, que a gente vai codificando segundo a segundo o comportamento da mãe. Então, tá olhando para o bebê, tá olhando para o ambiente, tá olhando, né, tá tocando o bebê, o que ela está fazendo segundo a segundo. Então, algumas coisas, ao olhar assim mais geral, passam desapercebidas, mas tem coisas, sim, professor Jair, que dá para perceber, né, principalmente quando são essas coisas mais gritantes, principalmente relacionadas a aspectos mais negativos. E, claro, também tem, no lado positivo, aquelas relações que, quando a gente... tem as relações que a gente assiste, pelo menos eu, né, eu assistia, interações que eu assistia, e eu ficava angustiado pelo bebê, porque você percebia que a mãe estava sendo intrusiva, ou hostil, né, ou algo assim. Tem interações que são mais neutras, e tem aquelas interações que ativa o nosso sistema empático, né? E a gente se sente feliz assistindo aquela interação, porque percebe que é uma interação em que há bastante attunement, né? Que a mãe está bastante sincronizada com o bebê, que há bastante afeto positivo. Então dá para perceber assim essas diferenças. Assim.
Legal, Marco. Acho que deu para entender, né, a complexidade do estudo. Andrea, are you still there?
Yes, I am here.
Hi, tell me something. Do you collect genome?
Yeah.
Do you collect the DNA?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Do
We
you think you are able to really to trying to find out what are the epigenetic changes in the genome? My God, yes. Andrea, you are unbelievable. Really?
Actually, we do have the third aim of the grant is a mechanistic aim. So we are investigating possible placentary mechanisms of transmission of the ACEs to the fetus. So we do have blood collected at enrollment, that means during pregnancy. We do have RNA and DNA from blood during labor. We do have placenta fragments on which we can evaluate a lot of things. And we have orogenes for genotyping after labor, that means between 2 and 6 weeks of life of the baby, and later on when the baby is 18 months. So we have a lot of biological samples collected. We have a -80 freezer completely full.
Very good, Andrea. Fascinating. Well, just for you who don't know, Andrea Jakowski is a professor here in the Department of Psychiatry. She is now in Norway for 1 year, but we hope she's coming back. We wish she's coming back. She will. She's finishing already. We are missing you, Andrea. So, quem mais? Salvador e Dartiu. Quem começa? Começa lá para o Dartiu, depois Salvador. Não sei quem que levantou primeiro, Salvador, mas eu ia te chamar, Salvador. Mas deixa o Dartiu falar e aí a gente...
Hi. Well, congratulations for your work in general and for your speech particularly. I have two questions. First of all, taking that study you mentioned about the soldiers, that oxytocin had the opposite effect. We are used to consider oxytocin as the love hormone. It's maybe the bond hormone. We may be bound by maybe by love or by hate. But I would like, what kind of hypothesis you have behind this finding? And the second question is, I've been working with psychedelics and particularly with, my question is particularly with ecstasy, MDMA, for PTSD and the treatment. And one of the alleged mechanisms for the action of ecstasies in the treatment of PTSD is the role of oxytocin. But wouldn't it be, if is it oxytocin and these people are traumatized veterans or victims of rape, like the case of PTSD, wouldn't be the case that in this specific situation, oxytocin would have the opposite effect, and not, it would enhance the traumatic events? It's just a question. What do you think about it?
Really wonderful questions. Close to my heart, a lot of things that I think about a lot. The first question about the aggression and the violence that might be associated with oxytocin. This is one study that was mentioned in a paper that I was reading. I'm not super familiar with the specifics of this study, but I think I spend a lot of time thinking about evolution and evolutionary psychiatry to kind of make sense of things. And I think of it a little bit as like a mama bear, where the bear is noticing that someone's coming after her babies. And so maybe the bear is very gentle and loving, but when it comes to protecting her young, it's another mama bear. And it's the same system. Like, I think in a lot of ways our biology is pretty primitive and simple, and it's like, okay, I'm going to protect my baby because this is my in-group. This is, the organism that I'm bonded to. And so I think it also makes sense because we know that oxytocin is so connected with the stress response, and the stress response is connected with fighting, fight or flight. And so I think all these systems are just very intertwined. And with the second question, there really isn't research out there, but one of my interests is also in psychedelics, psilocybin, ketamine, and it's very new research, but I think that the psychedelics, there's this idea that it can kind of reset your brain in different ways. And there also is, like love and relationships that can be influenced by psychedelics. And so I think that the hypothesis that when you are going through a psychedelic experience, especially if it's with therapy, maybe it can alter your oxytocin system. And maybe if, you're talking about PTSD, maybe if someone has experienced trauma and they go through a therapeutic psychedelic experience where they have a positive, like a relationship focused experience, then maybe it can change some of those PTSD neuronal pathways. I also am really interested in family therapy, and one of my dream research is to do family therapy for depressed adolescents, and maybe have the parents do some therapeutic psychedelic experience, ketamine or something, and see if the oxytocin system changes in some ways. I should also say that oxytocin research is quite complex and challenging because you can look at saliva, you can look at blood, and we don't know exactly how what we are measuring correlates with what's going on in your brain, but I think it's just a fascinating area of science and very exciting. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Good. Salvador, do you think now psychoanalysis and psychiatry, they finally met?
Não, eu ia falar uma coisa parecida. Eu não posso falar inglês, não tenho essa fluência. Mas que é muito é muito gratificante nessa idade eu estar presenciando uma mudança muito profunda de paradigma na psiquiatria e na ciência. Temos uma longa história secular de um pensamento cartesiano racionalista na ciência, em que os sentimentos são considerados um território fora da ciência, prejudicial até ao conhecimento científico. Imagina as consequências disso para a nossa civilização. E que agora a ciência, esse é o grande mérito da ciência, que está sendo capaz de se libertar desta frieza cartesiana e resgatar a importância dos sentimentos, da empatia, do relacionamento. Para a psiquiatria isso é importantíssimo, mas para todos, para fora da psiquiatria também, na ciência, na economia, na política, socialmente, evidentemente. Esperamos que dê tempo, que esses conhecimentos tenham tempo de produzir o seu efeito antes que coisas mais graves venham a acontecer.
Salvador, thank you. A little bit, well, 80% or 70% of what you said to her.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Are you a psychoanalyst? No. Probably, yeah. No, I think it's wonderful. I think, psychoanalysis got pushed to the side for a while, and talking about your relationship with your mother got, a bad rep, and people are like, no, we're just going to talk about how to change your thoughts or your behaviors. But I think, you have to also look at those early relationships and how important that they are. And also, like you said, relationships throughout your life and integrating all of that.
Andrea, do you want to make some, we have 7 minutes. Would you like to have some comments in Portuguese for people to understand, just to give a brief summary of all this experience we had with Dr. Sarah?
Yes, you want me to do in Portuguese? Ok. Eu vou contar, então, rapidamente a história desse projeto. Esse é um projeto temático numa linha de financiamento NIH FAPESP, onde o mérito do projeto foi avaliado pelo NIH e financiado pelo NIH nos Estados Unidos, e a FAPESP financia o projeto no Brasil. foi o único projeto aprovado nessa linha de pesquisa e que vai voltar agora. As relações da FAPESP com o NIH já voltaram ao normal, eles vão voltar a financiar projetos nessa área. Então, nesse projeto, nós incluímos 613 gestantes, entre 25 e 39 semanas gestacionais, com gestações de baixo risco, ou seja, sem obesidade, diabetes, hipertensão, gestações totalmente normais, para avaliar o impacto das adversidades na infância sobre o desenvolvimento da prole, sobre o neurodesenvolvimento da prole e o comportamento. De que forma? Avaliando a estrutura cerebral de 2 a 3 semanas logo após o parto, como a Célia explicou, fazendo um exame de ressonância que mostra que existem alterações de circuitarias cerebrais relacionadas às áreas de controle, já estão alteradas, e algumas circuitarias límbicas. Observamos também alterações de nível de cortisol nessas crianças. E quando a gente avalia mais à frente, vai avaliando aos 6, aos 14, aos 18 e aos 24 meses, essas crianças cujas mães têm altos índices de adversidades na infância, elas apresentam maior prevalência de comportamentos externalizantes aos 24 meses. Então, esse grant, apesar de ele ser grande, com 600 e poucas mães, a gente consegue observar até os 24 meses, esse aumento dos comportamentos externalizantes, e agora nós vamos para uma renovação e seguir essas crianças até os 5 anos, porque a hipótese por trás disso é que essas mesmas crianças vão ter um risco aumentado para TDAH aos 5 anos, e principalmente crianças do sexo masculino. E por que isso? Porque o sexo masculino, ele é mais vulnerável, e essa transmissão dos ACEs que acontece durante o período gestacional, ele está relacionado à biologia placentária, que ela está modificada, ela se modifica em virtude dos altos níveis de fatores inflamatórios e de cortisol, que acabam passando a barreira placentária e alterando o cérebro dessas crianças, alterando mais o cérebro de meninos do que de meninas. Então, rapidamente é isso, e com esse estudo, o que a gente espera trazer de informações que possam ser relevantes para a saúde pública? É mostrar que essas mães, na verdade, elas têm uma gestação de alto risco, mães que foram expostas a altos níveis de adversidades na infância, elas representam um grupo de risco, mas não um grupo de risco para diabetes e hipertensão, mas um grupo de risco para ter uma criança com risco aumentado, tanto para a obesidade quanto para possíveis comportamentos alterados já visíveis aos 24 meses. Acho que é isso.
Muito obrigado, Andrea. Muito legal. No, it's very important, because then she did summarize this wonderful work you have been doing. Time for last question. Everybody happy? Thank you for the Brazilian team who is doing this wonderful work. So we are very proud of you, really. And thank you very much, Sarah, for this wonderful presentation and bringing to our department all this news and this superb work of Andrea with the NIH, showing, this interaction between FAPESP and NIH, and doing a research that we understand is going to be in the frontier of knowledge in psychiatry and mental health. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you.
Obrigado, ouvindo a gentil recepção.
Very good. Very good.